Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, a passage known as the Pericope Adulterae. A Pericope de Adultera is a famous passage found in the Gospel of John 7:53-8:11. In this episode, after Jesus has sat down in the temple to teach some of the people after he spent the previous night at the Mount of Olives, a group of scribes and Pharisees confront Jesus, interrupting his teaching session. They bring in an adulteress and invite Jesus to pass judgment upon her, should she be stoned, as Moses taught, or not. Jesus first ignores the interruption and writes on the ground as though he does not hear them. But after the religious leaders continue the challenge, he states that the one who is without sin is the one who should cast the first stone. The religious leaders depart, leaving Jesus and the woman in the midst of the crowd. Jesus then asks the woman if anyone has condemned her. When she answers that no one has condemned her, Jesus says that he, too, does not condemn her, and tells her to go and sin no more. Although nothing in this story contradicts anything else in the Gospels, many analysts of the Greek text and manuscripts of the Gospel of John have argued that it was certainly not part of the original text of St. John's Gospel. The Jerusalem Bible claims the author of this passage is not John. On the other hand, Leo the Great cited the passage in his 62nd sermon, mentioning that Jesus said to the adulteress who was brought to him, "Neither will I condemn you, go and sin no more." In the early 400s, St. Augustine used the passage extensively, and from his writings it is also clear that his heretical contemporary Faustus also used it, as well as a group of unbelievers. The Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563, declared that the Latin Vulgate was authentic and authoritative. In terms of simple quantities, 1,476 Greek manuscripts include the Pericope Adulterae, and 267 do not include it. Among those 267, however, are some manuscripts which are exceptionally early and which most textual analysts consider the most important. The subject of Jesus's writing on the ground was fairly common in art, especially from the Renaissance onwards, with examples by artists including those by Peter Bruegel and Rembrandt. There was a medieval tradition originating in a comment attributed to Ambrose that the words written were terra terram accusat, which is shown in some depictions in art, for example the Codex Egbert. This is very probably a matter of guesswork based on Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 13. There have been other speculations about what Jesus wrote. The passage, John 7:53-8:11 in the New Revised Standard Version 53. Then each of them went home, 1. While Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. 2. Early in the morning he came again to the temple. All the people came to him and he sat down and began to teach them. 3. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery, and making her stand before all of them. 4. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery." 5. Now in the law Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say? 6. They said this to test him, so that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. 7. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." 8. And once again he bent down and wrote on the ground. 9. When they heard it, they went away, one by one, beginning with the elders, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. 10. Jesus straightened up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" 11. She said, "No one, sir." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go your way, and from now on do not sin again." Interpretation. This episode, and its message of mercy and forgiveness balanced with a call to holy living, have endured in Christian thought. Both "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," and "Go and sin no more" have found their way into common usage. The English idiomatic phrase "to cast the first stone" is derived from this passage. The passage has been taken as confirmation of Jesus' ability to write, otherwise only suggested by implication in the Gospels. But the word epsilon gamma rho alpha phi epsilon nu in John chapter 8 verse 8 could mean draw as well as write. Mosaic law. Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 22 to 24 states, "If a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then both of them shall die, the man that lay with the woman, and the woman. So you shall put away the evil from Israel. If a young woman who is a virgin is betrothed to a husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he humbled his neighbor's wife. So you shall put away the evil from among you." In this passage and also in Leviticus chapter 20 verse 10, death is fixed as the penalty of adultery, applicable to both the man and the woman concerned. However, stoning as the form of death is only specified when a betrothed virgin is violated, and is assumed to have consented. If she did not consent, she would have cried out, and in an urban setting her cry would have been heard. The Gospel narrative does not refer to the woman's partner in adultery being brought before Jesus or under threat of being punished. Textual history. The pericope is not found in most of the early Greek Gospel manuscripts. It is not in P66, and it is not in P75, both of which have been assigned to the late 100s or early 200s. Nor is it in two important manuscripts produced in the early mid-300s, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The first surviving Greek manuscript to contain the pericope is the Latin, Greek Diglot Codex Beza, produced in the 400s or 500s. Codex Beza is also the earliest surviving Latin manuscript to contain it. Out of 23 Old Latin manuscripts of John chapters 7 to 8, 17 contain at least part of the pericope, and represent at least 3 transmission streams in which it was included. According to Eusebius of Caesarea, Papias refers to a story of Jesus and a woman accused of many sins as being found in the Gospel of the Hebrews, which might refer to this passage or to one like it. In the Syriac Didascalia Apostolorum, composed in the mid-200s, the author, in the course of instructing bishops to exercise a measure of clemency, states that a bishop who does not receive a repentant person would be doing wrong, for you do not obey our Saviour and our God, to do as he also did with her that had sinned, whom the elders set before him, and leaving the judgment in his hands, departed. But he, the searcher of hearts, asked her and said to her, Have the elders condemned thee, my daughter? She said to him, No, Lord. And he said unto her, Go your way, neither do I condemn thee. In him therefore, our Saviour and King and God, be your pattern, O bishops. The Constitutions of the Holy Apostles, Book 2. 24, composed c. 380, echoes the Didascalia Apostolorum, alongside a utilization of Luke chapter 7 verse 47. Codex Fuldensis, which was produced in AD 546, and which, in the Gospels, features an unusual arrangement of the text that was found in an earlier document, contains the adulterae pericope, in the form in which it was written in the Vulgate. More significantly, Codex Fuldensis also preserves the chapter headings of its earlier source document, and the title of chapter number 120 refers specifically to the woman taken in adultery. The important codices L and delta do not contain the Pericope Adulterae, but between John chapter 7 verse 52 and 8:12, each contains a distinct blank space, as a sort of memorial left by the scribe to signify remembrance of the absent passage. Pacian of Barcelona, in the course of making a rhetorical challenge, opposes cruelty as he sarcastically endorses it. O novations, why do you delay to ask an eye for an eye? Kill the thief, stone the petulant. Choose not to read in the Gospel that the Lord spared even the adulteress who confessed, when none had condemned her. Pacian was a contemporary of the scribes who made Codex Sinaiticus. The writer known as Ambrosiaster, c. 370–380, mentioned the occasion when Jesus spared her who had been apprehended in adultery. The unknown author of the composition, Apologia David, mentioned that people could be initially taken aback by the passage in which we see an adulteress presented to Christ and sent away without condemnation. Quote, later in the same composition he referred to this episode as a lection in the Gospels, indicating that it was part of the annual cycle of readings used in the church services. Peter Chrysologus, writing in Venice, 450, clearly cited the Pericope Adulterae in his Sermon 115. Sedulius and Gelasius also clearly used the passage. Prosper of Aquitaine and Quadvoldius of Carthage, in the mid-400s, utilized the passage. A text called the Second Epistle of Pope Callistus section 6 contains a quote that may be from John chapter 8 verse 11, "Let him see to it that he sin no more, that the sentence of the gospel may abide in him. Go, and sin no more." However, this text also appears to quote from 8th century writings and therefore is most likely spurious. Until recently, it was thought that no Greek church father had taken note of the passage before the 1100s. However, in 1941 a large collection of the writings of Didymus the Blind was discovered in Egypt, in which Didymus states that we find in certain Gospels an episode in which a woman was accused of a sin, and was about to be stoned, but Jesus intervened, and said to those who were about to cast stones, "He who has not sinned, let him take a stone and throw it. If anyone is conscious in himself not to have sinned, let him take a stone and smite her." And no one dared, and so forth. This is far from a direct quotation, but it may be a loose summary of the episode, barring the possibility that Didymus was referring to some other gospel than the four-gospel collection that was typically used in the churches in his time. This reference appears to establish that the passage was present in its usual place in some Greek manuscripts known in Alexandria and elsewhere, from the 300s onwards. In Codex Vaticanus, which was produced in the early 300s, perhaps in Egypt, the text is marked at the end of John chapter 7 with an umlaut in the margin, indicating that an alternative reading was known at this point. This codex also has an umlaut alongside blank space following the end of the Gospel of John, which may convey that whoever added the umlaut was aware of additional text following the end of John chapter 21, which is where the Pericope Adulterae is found in the F1 group of manuscripts. Jerome, writing around 417, reports that the Pericope Adulterae was found in its usual place in many Greek and Latin manuscripts in Rome and the Latin West. This is confirmed by some Latin fathers of the 300s and 400s, including Ambrose of Milan and Augustine. The latter claimed that the passage may have been improperly excluded from some manuscripts in order to avoid the impression that Christ had sanctioned adultery. Certain persons of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest the wives should be given impunity in sinning, removed from the manuscripts the Lord's active forgiveness toward the adulteress, as if he who had said, "Sin no more," had granted permission to sin. History of textual criticism on John 7:53–8:11. The first to systematically apply the critical marks of the Alexandrian critics was Origen. In the Septuagint column used the system of diacritical marks which was in use with the Alexandrian critics of Homer, especially Aristarchus, marking with an obelus under different forms as called lemniscus and called a hyperlemniscus, those passages of the Septuagint which had nothing to correspond to in Hebrew, and inserting, chiefly from Theodotion under an asterisk, those which were missing in the Septuagint. In both cases a metabellus marked the end of the notation. Early textual critics familiar with the use and meaning of these marks in classical Greek works like Homer, interpreted the signs to mean that the section was an interpolation and not an original part of the Gospel. During the 16th century, Western European scholars, both Catholic and Protestant, sought to recover the most correct Greek text of the New Testament, rather than relying on the Vulgate Latin translation. At this time, it was noticed that a number of early manuscripts containing John's Gospel lacked John 7:53–8:11 inclusive, and also that some manuscripts containing the verses marked them with critical signs, usually a lemniscus or asterisk. It was also noted that, in the lectionary of the Greek Church, the Gospel reading for Pentecost runs from John chapter 7 verse 37 to 8:12, but skips over the 12 verses of this pericope. Beginning with Lagman, reservations about the pericope became more strongly argued in the modern period, and these opinions were carried into the English world by Samuel Davidson, Tregarthless, and others. The argument against the verses being given body and final expression in Hort. Those opposing the authenticity of the verses as part of John are represented in the 20th century by men like Cadbury, Colwell, and Metzger. According to 19th-century texts critics Henry Alford and F.H.A. Scriven of the passage was added by John in a second edition of the Gospel along with 5 to 3.4 and the 21st chapter. On the other hand, a number of scholars have strongly defended the Johannine authorship of these verses. This group of critics is typified by such scholars as Nolan and Bergen and Hoskier. More recently it has been defended by O.T. Fuller, and is included in the Greek New Testaments compiled by Wilbur Pickering, Hodges and Amp, Farstad and Robinson and Amp Pierpont, rather than endorsing Augustine's theory that some men had removed the passage due to a concern that it would be used by the wives as a pretense to commit adultery. Bergen proposed a theory that the passage had been lost due to a misunderstanding of a feature in the lection system of the early church. The theory that the passage was original, but was lost due to its treatment in an early lection cycle, explains not only its absence from some manuscripts, but also its appearance in the F1 group of manuscripts at the end of John, and its appearance in the F13 group after Luke chapter 21 verse 38. The same mechanism accounts for the movement of the passage in a smattering of manuscripts to precede John chapter 7 verse 37 and to follow John chapter 8 verse 12. One form of this theory is that at a very early date, an annual lection cycle was developed for the major feast days. In this lection cycle, a specific segment of the Gospel of John was assigned to be read at Pentecost, John chapter 7 verses 37 to 52, plus 8:12. This is still the form of the lection for Pentecost in the Byzantine lectionary cycle, attested in hundreds of copies. In an early copy used by a lector, marks were added to signify that the reader was to stop at the end of 7:52, and skip to the beginning of 8:12. When a professional copyist, unfamiliar with the lection cycle, used such a copy as his exemplar, he misunderstood the marks as if they meant that he, the copyist, should skip from the end of 752 to the beginning of 812, and thus the passage was dutifully skipped, and was lost, in a very influential transmission line. Another form of this theory is that a very early copyist, preparing a Gospels codex for liturgical use, transplanted the section to the end of John as a practical step, so as to simplify the lector's task on Pentecost, and after the section was thus transplanted, it dropped out altogether from the Alexandrian transmission line, which is represented by the oldest manuscripts, and from related branches. The transplantation of the passage in a few manuscripts to precede John chapter 7 verse 37, or to follow 8:12, is a scribal adaptation intended to simplify things for the lector by presenting the lection for Pentecost as one uninterrupted segment of text. Likewise, in the F13 group of manuscripts, the Pericope Adulterae has been transplanted out of the Gospel of John, and has been placed at the end of Luke chapter 21, so as to conveniently arrange the reading for St. Pelagia's feast day near Luke chapter 21 verses 12 to 19, the lection for Saints Sergius and Bacchus. Inasmuch as all these movements of the passage are different effects of the lection cycle, the complete absence of the passage, it is proposed, is just one more example of this phenomenon, albeit attested in manuscripts earlier than the earliest clear evidence of election cycle in which this passage was read at Pentecost. Defenders of the genuineness of the passage have also noted the following. In some of the early manuscripts in which the Pericope Adulterae does not appear after John chapter 7 verse 52, the final page of the Gospel of John has not survived, making it impossible to see whether or not the passage had been transplanted to the end of the book. In some medieval manuscripts in which the Pericope Adulterae does not appear after John chapter 7 verse 52 mentioned that the passage was found in ancient copies. In minuscule 565 unrelated copies, a note states that although the Pericope Adulterae was found following John chapter 7 verse 52, it was moved to the end of the Gospel of John. Several of these manuscripts also feature the Jerusalem colophon, which states that they were descended from, or proofread with, ancient copies at Jerusalem. Palestinian Aramaic evidence clearly shows that before it was made, the Pericope Adulterae had been transferred to the end of the Gospel of John. In many of the manuscripts in which asterisks or other marks appear in the margin alongside the passage, they do not accompany 752-8 to 2, but only 8 to 3-11, thus indicating where to find the lection for the feast day of Saint Pelagia. The notion that the asterisks in these copies were intended to express scribal doubt is a misunderstanding of the lectionary apparatus. Without 753 to 811 in the text, John's narrative shifts abruptly from a scene in which the religious leaders are gathered in their own meeting, to a scene in which Jesus is teaching in the temple treasury. It is intrinsically unlikely that anyone would begin a floating anecdote with the sentence, "and everyone went to his own house." Almost all modern translations include the Pericope Adulterae at John 7:53 to 8:11, but most enclose it in brackets, and or add a note mentioning the absence of the passage in the oldest witnesses. Authorship. Arguments against Johannine authorship. Bishop J. B. Lightfoot wrote that absence of the passage from the earliest manuscripts manuscripts, combined with the occurrence of stylistic characteristics atypical of John, together implied that the passage was an interpolation. Nevertheless, he considered the story to be authentic history. As a result, based on Eusebius's mention that the writings of Papias contained a story about a woman falsely accused before the Lord of many sins, he argued that this section originally was part of Papias' interpretations of the sayings of the Lord, and included it in his collection of Papias fragments. Barbieri concurs in misquoting Jesus, adding that the passage contains many words and phrases otherwise alien to John's writing. However, Michael W. Holmes has pointed out that it is not certain that Papias knew the story in precisely this form, inasmuch as it now appears that at least 2 independent stories about Jesus and a sinful woman circulated among Christians in the first 2 centuries of the Church, so that the traditional form found in many New Testament manuscripts may well represent a conflation of 2 independent shorter, earlier versions of the incident. Kyle R. Hughes has argued that one of these earlier versions is in fact very similar in style, form, and content to the Lucan special material, suggesting that the core of this tradition is in fact rooted in very early Christian memory. Arguments for Johannine authorship. There is clear reference of the Pericope Adulterae from the primitive Christian Church in the Syriac Didascalia Apostolorum. Zane C. Hodges and Arthur L. Farstad argue for Johannine authorship of the Pericope. They suggest there are points of similarity between the Pericope's style and the style of the rest of the Gospel. They claim that the details of the encounter fit very well into the context of the surrounding verses. They argue that the Pericope's appearance in the majority of manuscripts, if not in the oldest ones, is evidence of its authenticity.